In 1993, there was a country in Europe on the brink of collapse. Unemployment had hit 20%. Broken factories and jobless people filled the streets. The Financial Times gave a cold assessment. They called it a nation that would soon disappear from the map. Germany had given up on them, and Japan shook its head in refusal. France didn't even bother to look. Every developed nation in the world agreed. They said this country was finished. But right at that moment, a phone call came through. "We will invest." All of Europe laughed. Canada? That country's going to save Europe? At the time, the company from Canada was underestimated. They were seen as just a manufacturer from the frozen north. But 25 years later, the world was shocked. That company had become number one in the world. It was a miracle made by Canadians. How on earth did this happen? That unbelievable turnaround story begins now. Before we start, please take a moment. Please press the subscribe and like buttons, which only takes a second. And please let us know in the comments where you are watching this video. Your small interest gives us great strength. Let's get started right now. I covered the poorest country in Europe in 1993, with 20% unemployment, crumbling factories, and streets full of the unemployed. The Financial Times evaluated the country like this: a nation soon to disappear from the map. But here's the thing. 10 years later, that country became number one in the world. What exactly happened? I am Richard Blake. I have worked as a senior analyst at the European Industrial Economic Research Institute for 20 years. I received my PhD in economics from Oxford and participated in over 20 reconstruction projects in Eastern Europe. My motto was simple: groundless hope is poison. In January 1993, I arrived in Bratislava, the capital of Slovakia. It was just after Czechoslovakia had separated. I could feel it from the airport: a worn-out terminal, dim lights, and empty currency exchange booths. Even the air felt heavy. I went to see the site. It was an auto parts factory in the Žilina region. The moment I opened the door, the smell of rusting iron stung my nose. Giant press machines stood motionless, and red rust covered every machine. Grease and dust were piled high on the floor. Newspapers from 3 years ago still lay on the cafeteria tables. It was a place where time had stopped. An old man approached me. His name was Josef. He said he had worked in this factory for 30 years. Rust dust fell from his fingertips. The German companies refused, and the Japanese companies refused. "We have been abandoned," I wrote in my notebook. Probability of recovery, 0. I returned to Bratislava and met with a local economic official. We proposed to Germany, France, and Japan. We even offered the land for free, but they all refused. Despair was soaked into his voice. I wrote my report that night. The conclusion was clear. Slovakia is industrially irrecoverable, a country unsuitable for investment. The Financial Times assessment was no exaggeration. But a month later, a strange report came in. A Canadian company was considering investing in Slovakia. I laughed. Canada? At the time, in my mind, the Canadian auto industry was just a shadow of Detroit. A country known for maple syrup and hockey was going to save the sick man of Europe? It made no sense. But the reports kept coming. Canadian delegation visits, negotiations with local government begin. I became increasingly curious. What exactly were they seeing? In March, I went back to Slovakia. I saw the Canadian delegation for the first time in a worn-out conference room in Bratislava. 6 Canadians in dark suits looking to be in their mid-40s. Their eyes were strange. They didn't look tired. Instead, something was burning inside them. The meeting began. The Slovak Minister of Economy's voice was trembling. He was desperate. The Canadian representative asked, "How are the road conditions? Is the power supply stable?" The minister hesitated. At that moment, the Canadian representative spoke. "We will build it together." I doubted my ears. Build it together? Is this an investment negotiation or charity mission? After the meeting, I ran into the Canadian executive in the hallway. I asked him, "Why this country? Isn't Poland much better?" He thought for a moment and answered, "We don't go to the place with the best conditions. We go to the place that truly wants us." I couldn't sleep that night. His words lingered in my head. The place that truly wants us. This was not economics. The next day, I headed back to Žilina. People were gathered in front of that abandoned factory. There must have been about 100 people. Is it true the Canadian company is coming? I heard jobs are being created. Hope came alive in their eyes. Old man Joseph asked me, Doctor, is it really possible? I couldn't answer, because according to the data, it was impossible. But strangely, different words came out of my mouth. I don't know, but let's watch. I returned to Brussels that day. I wrote one line in my notebook. The Canadian variable, I cannot understand it, but I cannot ignore it. What on earth was about to happen? I didn't know. But one thing was certain, something was starting. And it was something that the economics I knew couldn't explain. In June, I heard surprising news in Brussels, Belgium. Canada's Aurora Motors had made the final decision to build a plant in Žilina, Slovakia. The investment scale was 700 million euros, with a goal of producing 300,000 vehicles annually. I shook my head while looking at the documents. It was madness. My colleagues felt the same. An analyst from Germany laughed, and a French colleague asserted they would withdraw within 3 years. But I was curious, what kind of calculation did they make? So I requested an interview with the Canadian headquarters. Surprisingly, it was approved. In July, I headed to Toronto. In the conference room of Aurora Motors headquarters in Toronto, I met the overseas business executives. They were calm. I asked the core question, why Slovakia and not Poland? Poland had a population of 38 million, and its infrastructure and market were overwhelming. The executive's answer was simple. He said the objective conditions were better in Poland, but they saw something else. It was Slovakia's desperation. He said Prime Minister Mikuláš Dzurinda came to the negotiation table himself and staked the nation's fate. He said they would give the land for free, eliminate taxes, and tunnel through mountains to build roads. And the executive added one sentence. It was the words of Chairman Robert Miller. We go where we are sincerely wanted, not where the conditions are easy. He said Canada was like that in the past too. There were countries that believed in them when no one else would invest. I was speechless. This was not business logic. It was a conviction. The executive continued. He said he knew the European press was laughing at Canada. But he said they were used to it. When they built highways across the Canadian Shield, when they started drilling for oil in the frozen sands, the world called them crazy. But they did it. I couldn't sleep in my hotel room in Toronto that night. Their eyes kept coming to mind. That wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. Not a groundless certainty, but a certainty born of experience. In August, I went back to Slovakia. Downtown Žilina was excited. Banners saying Canada is coming were hung everywhere, and vitality began to return to the streets. I went to the factory site. Outside the small village of Žilina, there was only a desolate field and winding country roads. Mountains were visible in the distance. I shook my head. They are going to produce 300,000 cars a year here, a local city official explained. The Canadian side demanded a lot. A 4-lane highway, expanded power supply, water supply facilities. The Slovak government promised to build it all within a year. They said they had to do it, because this was their last chance. In September, the groundbreaking ceremony was held. I attended by invitation. The Slovak Prime Minister, the Minister of Economy, the Canadian Ambassador, and Aurora Motors executives were there. I also saw Old Man Joseph. He was wearing a suit. Chairman Robert Miller of Aurora Motors held the shovel. At that moment, applause erupted. It was the residents. Hundreds of people were cheering. A woman was crying. Watching that scene, I wrote in my notebook, "This is not just factory construction, but the beginning of a nation's resurrection." After the ceremony, I met the Canadian site manager. He was an engineer in his early 40s. I asked him, "Is completion within a year possible by European standards? Even 3 years is not enough." He answered confidently, "We said we would do it in a year, so we will do it." I asked back if it wasn't physically impossible. He smiled and said, "The word impossible is not in our dictionary." I returned to Brussels that day. I told my colleagues, they are serious and they will really do it. My colleagues laughed. They asked if I had been charmed by the Canadians. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my notebook. There, it was written, "The Canadian way is not logic, but will, and before that will, European common sense is crumbling." Can they really do it? I couldn't be sure, but I knew one thing. They wouldn't give up, and that is the most terrifying power. In October, full-scale construction began. I went back to Zelina to see the site. Heavy equipment had entered the desolate field. Engineers from Canada were surveying in freezing weather. I watched them. They worked without rest from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. There were no weekends. It was a speed unimaginable by European standards, a Slovak construction official said to me. The Canadians don't seem to sleep. We can't keep up with them. I nodded. They weren't just workers. They were moving steel. Returning to Brussels that day, I thought. This isn't just a construction project. The spirit of a nation called Canada is being transplanted onto European soil. In January 1994, I headed to Zelina again. It was winter. The temperature dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. European construction sites usually go into winter shutdown at this time. Work is impossible because of the snow and cold. But the Zelina site was different. At 5 a.m., when I arrived at the site, the lights were already brightly lit. The sound of heavy machinery was echoing. I doubted my eyes. They were building in minus 20-degree weather. Canadian engineers were roaming the site in thick parkas. White steam rose from their breath. Slovak workers were working alongside them. Their expressions had changed. The resignation I saw 3 months ago was gone, and something else was filling that space. I went to find the site manager. He was spreading out blueprints in a container office. I asked, "How do you continue construction in this cold?" He answered simply, "If we stop, we can't meet the schedule. We have to keep our promise." Besides, he grinned, this is just a mild autumn day in Edmonton. I looked around the site. Huge steel structures were being erected one by one. The outline of a factory began to appear in a place that was a wasteland just 3 months ago. I wrote in my notebook, "This is not construction, it is a war against time." In February, surprising news was heard. Partner companies from Canada were coming in. About 10 companies, including steel suppliers and parts manufacturers. They were also building factories near Zelina. I couldn't understand. Just Aurora Motors alone is a gamble, but partner companies are entering together. This was not a normal business judgment. I met with a representative from a Canadian parts supplier. He explained, "If Aurora goes, we go. That is the way of our industry." Only then did I realize they weren't moving just one factory. It was an entire industrial ecosystem. They were replicating the system that worked in Canada, from parts supply to logistics to quality control. In March, the village of Zelina was completely different. Signs for Canadian companies began to appear everywhere. Diners serving Western food opened, and Canadian shops appeared. The entire village was transforming into an industrial complex. I met old man Joseph again. He was now working at the Aurora Motors construction site. He was a safety management assistant. Life had returned to his face. He said, "For the first time in 30 years, I see a future. I have something to pass on to my grandson." In May, I witnessed an amazing sight. The factory building frame was completed. It was only 8 months after construction began. It was a speed that made no sense by European standards. The factory Volkswagen built in the Czech Republic took a year and a half just for the frame. I thought while walking through the site, what fuels these people? It couldn't be explained by money alone. It wasn't honor either. Something more fundamental was moving them. In July, the installation of the first production line finally began. Equipment shipped from Canada arrived. Huge presses, welding robots, painting facilities. I felt breathless watching that scene. A Slovak technician told me, "We are learning a lot from the Canadians. Their method is completely different. They talk about best hustle all the time." At first I couldn't understand, but now I'm saying it too. I laughed. Canadian culture was contagious. It wasn't just technology being transferred. Attitude and spirit were being transferred. In September, I was shocked once again. Test driving began. It had been less than a year since construction started. I went inside the factory. The huge production line was running. The sound of metal, mechanical noises, people shouting. And it was that moment. The first Aurora car left the production line. It was a silver sedan. The engine roared. That sound resonated in my chest. This was not just an engine sound. It was the sound of a country's heart starting to beat again. Slovak employees applauded. Some were crying. Canadian engineers were hugging each other too. Watching that scene, I wrote in my notebook, "Miracles begin not with an explosion, but with the hum of an engine." I didn't return to Brussels that night. I stayed in Zelina. Through the hotel window, I could see the lights of the factory. It was running 24 hours a day. I admitted it for the first time. I was wrong. Canada is making the impossible possible. In early 1995, I heard unexpected news. Quality issues arose at the Aurora, Slovakia plant. The defect rate of early produced vehicles exceeded 30%. I nodded. As expected. This was the price of prioritizing speed. The European press was buzzing. The Financial Times reported it as the limit of the North American rush. Der Spiegel in Germany was more direct. Aurora's entry into Europe will end in failure, colleagues in the Brussels office said to me. See, we told you it would end like this. I didn't refute them. The data was on their side. But I was curious. How would the Canadians respond? In March, I went back to Zelina. The atmosphere in this factory was heavy. Anxiety was spreading among Slovak employees. Several local technicians had resigned. They said the Canadian working style was too intense. They said it didn't fit their culture. Signs of labor conflict were also visible. I walked inside the factory. The production line was stopped. Canadian engineers were checking defective vehicles one by one. Their expressions were dark, but their eyes were different. They didn't give up. In April, an emergency dispatch team arrived from the Canadian headquarters. It was 20 quality control experts. I watched them. They started working the very night they arrived. At 2 a.m., I happened to pass by the factory and saw lights. When I went in, Canadian engineers were tearing down the production line. They checked, measured, and recorded everything one by one. They weren't sleeping. I asked an engineer, "Why are you going this far?" He answered simply, "We have to keep our promise." The Slovak people trusted us. Change began in May. The defect rate started to drop, from 30% to 20%, then down to 10%. In June, it went down to 5%. In July, the defect rate hit 3%. It was lower than the European average. I couldn't hide my surprise. How on earth did they do it? I met the quality control manager. He explained, "We didn't just fix the problems, we changed the system. We sent Slovak employees to Canada for retraining." And he said one more thing. He said Canadian managers worked directly on the floor, sweating together instead of giving orders from desks. That moved the hearts of the Slovak employees. Hearing that, I thought, this wasn't a problem of technology. It was a problem of trust. In August, I witnessed a surprising scene. The Slovak technicians who had resigned returned. One technician said, "I realized the Canadians were sincere. They didn't give up on us." Production normalized. The factory ran 24 hours a day again. I visited the factory late at night. It was beating like a huge heart. The sound of metal, mechanical noises, people shouting. I wrote in my notebook that day. The Canadians didn't solve the impossible. They denied it. For them, a crisis was not an end, but a beginning. In September, the tone of the European press began to change. The Financial Times reported on Aurora, Slovakia's recovery. German media also began to pay attention to Canadian-style quality control. I returned to Brussels. Colleagues asked, "How did they recover so quickly?" I answered. "They didn't fix the problem. They changed the culture. That is the Canadian way." I realized then. I began to doubt my arrogance. The European logic I had believed in all my life was shaking. Canada was refuting my academics, and they were right. In June 1996, I received a special invitation. It was the official rollout ceremony of the Aurora, Slovakia plant. It was 3 years after ground was broken. It was an absurdly fast speed by European standards. I headed to Zelina. I could feel the difference from the airport. The city, which was old and dark just 3 years ago, was full of vitality. New buildings stood on the streets and shops had opened. When I arrived at the ceremony, I felt breathless. The huge factory building was sparkling in the sunlight. Hundreds of finished cars were lined up in the parking lot. Silver, blue, black, all cars made in Slovakia. Thousands of people gathered at the venue. The Slovak Prime Minister, the Minister of Economy, representatives of the European Union, and the residents of Zelina. I also saw old man Jozef. He stood with his family in a clean suit. Chairman Robert Miller took the podium. He spoke briefly. "Slovakia trusted us. It is an honor to repay that trust." As the translation ended, applause erupted. It was thunderous, and the moment came. The first finished car left the production line and entered the venue. The engine roared. Listening to that sound, I recalled 3 years ago. A desolate field, a rusting factory, people in despair. Slovak employees stood up. Applause poured out, and some were crying. A woman next to me spoke. My son works in that factory. 3 years ago, I couldn't even imagine. Watching that scene, I wrote in my notebook. This was not just a factory, but the reconstruction of a city. It was the resurrection of a country. After the ceremony, I joined a factory tour. Walking through the production line, I couldn't hide my surprise. Everything was working perfectly. Pressing, welding, painting, assembly. It was running without a single error. A young Slovak technician explained to me. I learned from a Canadian mentor. It was hard to keep up at first, but now we can do it too. He looked proud. I asked, "What did you learn most from the Canadians?" He thought for a moment and answered, "The spirit of getting it done, the belief that nothing is impossible." I laughed. Canadian culture had completely taken root. It wasn't just technology that was transferred. Spirit, attitude, and values were transferred. In July, amazing data was released. The unemployment rate in the Žilina region dropped to 5%. It was a figure that was 20% 3 years ago. It was thanks to the Aurora factory. 3,000 direct hires and over 10,000 jobs created, including partner companies. The local economy also came alive. Shops opened and restaurants opened their doors. Schools were built and hospitals expanded. The village of Žilina was no longer a poor countryside. It was transforming into an industrial city. In August, I met old man Josef again. He was now a safety manager at the Aurora factory. We sat in a cafe near the factory. "It was a cafe that didn't exist 3 years ago," Josef said. "Canada saved us. When Europe abandoned us, Canada reached out a hand." His voice trembled. "My grandson is going to university now. He says he wants to be an engineer." Hearing that made my heart feel heavy. This wasn't just economic success. People's lives had changed. A future had been created. In September, the Slovak government announced. Regional GDP growth recorded 7%. It was more than double the national average. European media began to pay attention. The Financial Times ran a special feature. The title was "The Canadian Industrial Miracle, Recreated in Europe." Germany's Der Spiegel followed, reporting, "The Canadian model is the new paradigm." I looked at those articles and thought, the decision I laughed at 3 years ago, the choice I thought was madness, was right. I returned to Brussels and wrote a report. The title was simple: Canada, the New Hope of European Industry. My colleagues were surprised. They said they didn't know I would write such a report. I answered, "You know, if you see the site, there are things data alone cannot tell you. Canada didn't export products. They transmitted hope." I opened my notebook that night. There, it was written. Miracles begin not with an explosion, but with the hum of an engine. And that engine sound is echoing along the Danube River right now. In September 2008, the world shook. Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and the global financial crisis exploded. I was tense watching the news in my Brussels office. I thought no one could avoid it this time. In October, the European automotive industry began to collapse. Germany's Opel announced production cuts, and France's Peugeot considered closing factories. Spain's Seat laid off 30% of its staff. All of Europe fell into fear. I was worried. What will happen to Slovakia? Can Aurora Motors survive? Will the miracle of 12 years ago collapse this time? In November, I headed to Žilina. The airport was quiet, and the streets were dark. The shadow of the recession was cast. I went to the Aurora factory. The factory parking lot was piled with more finished cars than before. Cars that weren't selling. I sighed. It's not going to work this time. But the factory didn't stop. The production line was still running and employees were working. I was puzzled. Other factories are all cutting production, so why is Aurora continuing? I met the plant manager. He explained. It's an order from the Canadian headquarters. Do not cut production, protect the employees. I was surprised. Economically, it made no sense. Demand has plummeted, but maintain production. Inventory will just pile up. I asked, why make such a decision? The plant manager answered, Canada thinks of people first in a crisis. We keep our promises over profit. That was the reason we chose Slovakia 12 years ago. In December, surprising news was heard. Aurora announced it would maintain employment for all Slovak employees. It was all 3,000 of them. There were no wage cuts either. It was the only case in Europe. The Slovak press was buzzing. Articles with titles like "The Loyalty of a Canadian Company" poured out. Volkswagen in Germany laid off 2,000 people at its Czech plant, but Aurora Canada didn't fire a single person. I met employees in front of the factory. A middle-aged man said, "Canada didn't abandon us. They are keeping the promise from 12 years ago." Tears welled up in his eyes. In March 2009, the situation reversed. While other European factories were stopped, only Aurora continued production, digging into the niche that competitors couldn't supply. Orders started pouring in. Aurora Slovakia's market share skyrocketed. It jumped from 6% to 10%. Cars piled up as inventory sold out in an instant. I couldn't hide my surprise. In June, I saw even more surprising data. Slovakia's GDP rebounded. While all of Europe was in negative growth, only Slovakia recorded positive growth. It was thanks to the Aurora factory. Only then did I realize Canada didn't exploit the crisis. They turned trust into capital. They protected the employees, and those employees worked harder. Consumers knew that and chose Aurora. In September, European media poured out analysis articles. The titles were "The Victory of Canadian Management." The Financial Times wrote, "A Canadian company taught Europe new ethics." I met old man Joseph again. He was now in his 70s, but still working at the factory. He said, "Canada didn't abandon us 12 years ago, and they didn't abandon us now." My heart felt overwhelmed hearing those words. This wasn't just business, it was a relationship. It was trust. I returned to Brussels and wrote a special report. The title was "Canadian Philosophy Proven in Crisis." My colleagues read it and spoke. "Now we must learn from Canada. Europe must learn." I nodded, and I wrote in my notebook. Canada chose people over profit, and that choice eventually created greater profit. This is true capitalism. This is true growth. I thought that night. What was the economics I learned all my life? Canada was rewriting my textbook, and I was willing to become a student. In 2015, I received a shocking report. It was the latest statistics released by the European Industrial Economic Research Institute. Slovakia recorded the world's #1 car production per 1,000 people. It was 198 vehicles. I checked the numbers again. Not Germany, not Japan, but Slovakia, the country called the sick man of Europe 22 years ago. I tore apart the data. The Aurora factory was producing 300,000 cars annually, Volkswagen 400,000, and Peugeot Citroën 300,000. A small country with a population of 5 million was making over 1 million cars a year. I held my breath looking at the graph. They surpassed Germany, surpassed Japan, and surpassed the United States in just 22 years. I wrote in my notebook, I doubted my eyes. The sick man of Europe has become the heart of the world. In June, I headed to Žilina again. It was a revisit after 22 years. I was shocked from the airport. The old terminal had turned into a modern building, and a 4-lane highway led to downtown. Downtown Žilina was completely different. The streets that were dark and gloomy 22 years ago were bright and lively. Modern shopping malls were built, and cafes and restaurants lined the streets. Young people walked the streets. I headed to the village of Žilina. The place that was a desolate field 22 years ago had turned into a huge industrial complex. Dozens of partner company buildings were lined up around the Aurora factory. The factory scale had also grown enormously. It looked 3 times larger than the first building 22 years ago. The parking lot was packed with thousands of finished cars, and trailers were constantly coming and going. I applied for a factory tour. As I entered, cutting-edge facilities caught my eye. Robot automation lines, smart process systems, eco-friendly painting facilities. It was on a different level from the factory I saw 22 years ago, a young Slovak engineer explained. This factory is one of the most efficient in Aurora's global network. Even the headquarters in Toronto comes to benchmark us. I couldn't hide my surprise. The country that came to learn has become a country that teaches, the engineer answered proudly. We learned from Canada, and now we can do it too. I visited the technical university in the city. It was a school that didn't exist 22 years ago. Automotive engineering students were dismantling engines in the practice room, the professor said. Most graduates go to Aurora or partner companies. The employment rate is 95%. I asked a student, "Why did you choose automotive engineering?" He smiled and answered, "My grandfather worked at Aurora, and my father works at Aurora. Of course, I'm going to Aurora too." Hearing that, I realized this isn't just a factory. It has become a tradition spanning generations. It had become the life of a family, the identity of a city. I looked for old man Yosef, but they said he had already passed away. Instead, I met his son. The son was a production team leader at the Aurora factory. He said the grandson was a junior at the technical university. The son spoke. My father always said this before he passed away. He said Canada saved us and never to forget that. My heart felt heavy. 22 years had passed, but that gratitude remained. It was being passed down through generations. I went up to the factory rooftop. Wait, I could see the river in the distance. Beyond the river, the industrial complex stretched endlessly. It was a completely different landscape from what I saw 22 years ago. I opened my notebook and I wrote. I saw with my own eyes the Canadian spirit replicated in Europe. What Canada built was not a factory, but a nation's pride. I returned to Brussels and wrote a special report. The title was The Miracle of Slovakia, Canada engraved at its center. It was distributed to European governments and noted by the media. Contact came from the German Ministry of Economy. They said they wanted to study the Canadian model and seek advice. France was the same. Europe had now started to learn from Canada. I thought that night, the decision I laughed at 22 years ago, the choice I thought was madness, is changing all of Europe. In 2018, I was invited to an international industrial forum. The venue was Geneva. The theme was New Paradigms of Global Industrial Cooperation. I was selected as the keynote speaker. I looked over the data again before standing on the podium. They were amazing figures. The miracle Canada created in Slovakia was now spreading all over the world. It was Vietnam. A Canadian tech giant built a huge factory complex in the northern province of Bac Ninh. It became responsible for 25% of Vietnam's total exports. One company was supporting a nation's economy. It was Poland. A Canadian energy firm built a battery plant, making the region the center of the European battery industry. Canadian defense companies also entered. Advanced Canadian tanks and artillery became the main force of the Polish military. It was the United Arab Emirates. 4 nuclear power plants were completed. It was a Canadian reactor model, generating power in the middle of the desert, changing the energy map of the Middle East. I stood on the podium. Representatives from over 50 countries were sitting in the audience. I grabbed the microphone and I spoke. I will tell you a story that began in Slovakia 25 years ago. I recalled my first visit in 1993. Desolate factories, despairing people, a country no one cared about. And I spoke of the moment Canada reached out. The audience concentrated. I continued. Canada chose the place that sincerely wanted them, not the place with good conditions. They chose people over profit. They kept their promises even in crisis. And I showed the results. Slovakia became the world's #1 car producer. Vietnam became a hub for the global electronics industry, and Poland became the core of the European defense industry. I summarized it in one sentence. Canada didn't export factories. They propagated hope. They didn't sell technology. They shared civilization. Applause erupted. It was a standing ovation. At that moment, I recalled 25 years ago. Back when colleagues laughed, back when they said Canada was crazy. After the presentation, representatives from many countries approached me. The Minister of Economy of Rwanda asked, "How can we attract Canadian companies? They said they want to be like Slovakia." I answered, "Show your sincerity. Canada responds to authenticity rather than conditions, just like Slovakia did 25 years ago." At the dinner, the German representative spoke. He said Germany must learn the Canadian model, that German management, which only pursued efficiency, has hit a limit. The French representative also nodded. Watching that scene, I was deeply moved. Europe, which ignored Canada just 25 years ago, was now treating Canada as a teacher. After the forum, I headed to Zelina again. I wanted to finish the history of 25 years. When I stood in front of the factory, a huge maple leaf flag was fluttering in the wind. My eyes became hot looking at that flag. When I first stood here 25 years ago, I was cynical. I laughed, asking what Canada could do if they could save the sick man of Europe. But I was wrong. Canada did it. They made the impossible possible and turned despair into hope. They raised a country and were now changing the world. I walked to the Danube River. The river water sparkled in the sunlight. From the factory in the distance, the sound of engines could be heard. It was the same sound as that day 25 years ago. I opened my notebook. I wrote the last sentence. The miracle of the North did not end as Canada's story. It has now become the language of humanity. I returned to Brussels and wrote the final report. The title was The Miracle on the Danube and Canada. It contained 25 years of observation and analysis. The report was submitted to the EU headquarters and distributed to governments. The World Bank adopted it as official reference material. A new category called Canadian-Style Industrial Cooperation Model was created. I decided to retire. It was the end of 40 years of life as an economist. Colleagues threw a farewell party. They asked, "What is the most memorable project?" I answered without hesitation. "It is Slovakia, the miracle Canada created." I said it wasn't just an economic project, but an experience that changed my life. I returned home that night and opened my notebooks from the last 25 years, records written every time I visited Zelina, from 1993 to 2018. I looked at the first page. There it was written, probability of recovery 0. I laughed. I didn't know how wrong I was. I opened the last page, the sentence written today. Canada is a country that raises the world. I am now certain. In 1993, there was a country called the sick man of Europe. No one cared, and the world gave up on that country. But Canada was different. They reached out, sweated together, and kept their promises. Over 30 years later, that country became #1 in the world. The seed of hope planted by Canada blossomed on European soil, Richard Blake said. Canada didn't export factories, but propagated hope. That is the real miracle. The maple leaf flag fluttering over the Danube River. That was not a flag of one country's success, but a proof of humanity's possibility. Canada's story continues. In Slovakia, in Vietnam, in Poland, and all over the world. Everyone, this is Canada. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe for more stories.